Welcome to our October webcast on cool technologies. This is part of our monthly webinar series where we share research openly and have a discussion with supply chain leaders. My name is Laura Ciceri. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and today I want to talk about cool technologies. As we go along, please put your questions in the question panel. I'll take your questions as we go along and hopefully have a dialogue. It's far more interesting to have a dialogue than a one-way conversation. So coal technologies, what do I classify as coal? Well, a different approach that adds value. I like to think of myself a lot like this gal, that's out there looking at the market, trying to figure out what technologies are different and are driving value. So let's start at the drivers. One of the things that's driving us to adopt new technologies is the need for the customer-centric supply chain. Most companies have defined supply chains in a way that the customer gets lost. One of my favorite things to do is to have people draw the supply chain. And of 150 companies that I've had in my boot camp, only one employee or one participant has drawn the supply chain with a customer. Most of the supply chains are drawn without customers, and they're drawn from materials or manufacturing, and our supply chains are very functional. But the supply chain of the future is very much about regulations and social responsibility and about the channel. And this requires us to look at different data forms. The old-fashioned supply chain of transactional data and functional processes really didn't need unstructured data, didn't really need streaming data. But as we move towards more corporate social responsibility, greater regulations, more geopolitical risk, then it's a time that we need to really rethink the supply chain. So we're at a transition. Traditional supply chain thinking is functional, it's linear, it's transactional, it's inside out, it's all about the company. But moving forward, the thinking becomes cross-functional. How do I get the channel designed so that we can maximize value for the channel? And how do I deal with the non-linearity of the long tail or the non-linearity of scarce resources? And how can I have a supply chain that can sense, learn, and act and have a semantic reasoning layer and be outside in so that I can sense and respond to the market as the market is evolving? So a tipping point, we've designed most supply chains from the back forward, suppliers, manufacturing, distribution. And the question is, how do we move to designing the supply chain from the customer back, from consumption back? And that often requires a redesign and a rethinking of supply chains. As a supply chain leader, I do studies. I've done a study every year where I've asked this question of what is the largest business pain in supply chain? And I get the same answers of, I don't have visibility. People define visibility very differently. I lack cross-functional alignment, I can't use data, and my executive team lacks the understanding of supply chain. So as we get into technologies and technology shifts, we can get at the answers to some of these questions, but only if we start to redefine what is supply chain from the customer back, from the channel back, and not define supply chain from materials forward. Well, so let's start with people. I love what's happening in the world of data science. I love the possibilities of schema on read, where we can read schema as we need it versus the traditional supply chain approach, which made us force all the data into predefined schema, which caused it to be obsolete as the business changed. However, the top 3 positions that are of greatest scarcity or need in the supply chain are data scientists, demand planners, and supply planners. And we've got an issue where data scientists are not only at a premium or a shortage in the market, there's often a shortage of understanding of supply chain by the data scientists. So the data scientists come to the supply chain with a different language and a different paradigm, and they're butting up against people that are used to transactional systems and fixed schema, and they talk different languages and they see the world very differently. But we're at a shortage. So often people that have data scientists are sort of like dogs chasing their tail. The data scientists are doing small one-off projects, but they're struggling to make them systemic. And in this world of analytics, where we first have descriptive analytics, which are tools like Power BI by Microsoft or ClickView, and I'm going to talk about a new descriptive analytics tool called Thoughtspot. Thoughtspot allows us to combine search with pattern recognition to answer the questions we don't know to ask. The predictive analytics, which is largely optimization, and that optimization is moving from linear to nonlinear. We've got the introduction of pattern recognition into the predictive, to prescriptive, which we're seeing a lot in the evolution of visibility networks. So it's not only what is it, but what should we do about it, to cognitive. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about how the analytics technologies are embracing data science and what we're seeing in the market. But as we do, we've got to be grounded on the differences of these types of analytics. Now, in contrast, 72% of planning is done on Excel spreadsheets, which is not descriptive, not predictive, not prescriptive, not cognitive. So we've got a very large change transformation that we're approaching of how do we use these new technologies and what do we use to drive change moving forward. Now, I do research, quantitative research, using my following of 315,000 people on LinkedIn. And when I ask people about analytics and the most disruptive analytics, what's disruptive today and what's going to be disruptive in the future, data visualization and Internet of Things rate the highest at the current state. But in the future, blockchain and cognitive computing, software robots rate higher. Now, today I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about blockchain and cognitive computing, and I'll just say that software robots are being deployed more, but for software robots to really be able to drive the value, we need to have the semantic reasoning layer that we're starting to develop in cognitive computing, so those software robots can sense, learn, and act, and not just do rote tasks. So I think data visualization has driven tremendous value for the companies. I'm continue to be very impressed by Power BI. The Internet of Things platforms like Savvy Technology, or what we're seeing in the evolution of pharma, where we're able to use Internet of Things, are also driving a lot of value. One of the cool technologies that I really think has driven value for my clients in the descriptive analytics area is a tool called Thoughtspot. Now, Thoughtspot is a little different than Power BI in that it is a search engine. It's a relational search engine. Imagine that you can put Thoughtspot across many forms of systems. So my average client has 100 different systems, and it allows business users to use Thoughtspot, much like Google search bar, to be able to input what is it that you're searching for. So I'll give you an example. I used Thoughtspot at a client and two different divisions. The first division wanted to know, why do I short orders? They had 3 ERP systems, 4 advanced planning systems, and it took 4 months and 3 consultants to answer the question, why were they shorting orders? Same company, next division that we went into, we put Thoughtspot on top of the technologies, and we did relational search, and we had an answer within 3 days. of why was the company shorting orders and how did the order shortage information tie to compliance fees. What we're seeing right now in consumer products is a large increase in compliance fees where retailers are charging the companies that are manufacturing goods higher fees because of orders either not arriving on time or orders being shorted at the time of shipment. And in this particular case, we put Thoughtspot as a relational search tool on top of the enterprise system, which was very disparate. The data was really ugly and dirty, and we were able to cut down the time to get to an answer. But more importantly, Thoughtspot allows us to really answer questions that we don't know to ask. So there's a pattern recognition feature of Thoughtspot that says, Laura, you've been asking these kind of questions, so did you know that, this kind of information is also available in the data, and it allows the system to push you information based upon your prior search. I think search and that kind of recognition is a very powerful, cool technology. So if you haven't looked at Thoughtspot, I would encourage you to do that. Thoughtspot is pretty reasonably priced based upon revenue, and it's designed for business user to usage. It's easier to use than Power BI, and it's a form of descriptive analytics that's in the market. Now, as we talk about the movement of analytics, not from manufacturing and sourcing back, but from the customer and the channel back, we get into more and more disparate data types. We get into more machine-generated data, more unstructured data, rating and review, traffic density, call center information. And this data gets us into semi-structured and unstructured data, and we also get greater volume and velocity of data. And so this is very different than the old-fashioned supply chain, where I assumed that the supply chain would be driven off of ERP data. Now, an example of this is listening. Companies that are good at CustomerCentric are really good at listening. They use sentiment analysis, unstructured text mining. This is an example from SAS sentiment analysis, and SAS is currently putting text miner and sentiment analysis on top of the VIA platform, which allows you to take unstructured data and to look at patterns. So companies that are very advanced at this will have a cross-functional team that will look at listening and mining of unstructured text on a weekly basis. So this might be warranty data for auto, or it might be quality data for pharmaceutical, or perhaps looking at serialization, cold chain data, and root cause analysis in pharmaceutical. Every industry is a little different. This is a Lenovo example, and it actually came from my conference 2 years ago, where Lenovo has a listening post. They use SAS sentiment analysis, and this is an example of where they were listening on part quality conformance for the Yoga computer, and they were looking for what are the patterns. So primarily they were looking for quality of suppliers. So they had, for example, 5 keyboard malfunctions, or they had battery issues. It allows them to take and look at pattern recognition across many forms of unstructured data. So this could be call center data, warranty data, return data. I work with one client where we implemented this on top of emails. The client did annual surveys to understand, how were they doing? And so we put sentiment analysis on top of emails. They had about 15,000 emails a month that they got from their customers, and they started to mine the data off of the emails. So we've talked about descriptive analytics. I gave you an example of Thoughtspot, which was relational search, sentiment analysis, which is mining unstructured data. And again, we're designing the supply chain from the customer back. We also have had in the last year a lot of advancement in cognitive computing in the supply chain. And I'm going to define cognitive computing as the ability to have a semantic reasoning layer to allow us to learn, sense, and act. There's a lot of advancements around pattern recognition and machine learning, but machine learning and pattern recognition allow us to see patterns, but not necessarily to have the reasoning layer to sense, learn, and act. So we've got many things happening in the market. We've got the mergers and acquisitions. JDA bought Blue Yonder, which is primarily a demand planning retail push for JDA. But I don't expect JDA to go deep into cognitive computing because of the legacy JDA. LlamaSoft just bought OpEx Analytics, and OpEx Analytics has 140 data scientists. And LlamaSoft has a tool called Demand Guru, which is schema and read, and I expect that LlamaSoft will continue to do schema and read work with OpEx Analytics to be able to look at how do we use the new techniques for data scientists, Python and R, to be able to do open source analytics and schema and read onto the LlamaSoft platform to allow us to be far more flexible. Logility bought Halo about 18 months ago. I haven't seen a lot of progression out of that. Halo was an open source analytics tool, really quite nice and configurable. I've seen a lot of turnover out of that acquisition, so I think that technology will help Logility, but I do not expect Logility or JD Yonder to really make a step change in their current technologies to drive rapid improvement. On the other hand, we have new technology approaches in the market. We've got Era technology. It was my hope that Anaplan would become far better and deeper in cognitive computing, but I've not seen that. Alloy AI is doing work on demand sensing, pattern recognition, and price. And Terra Solutions has been working on semantic reasoning. I did a recent announcement with Nestle, has some work that is going on around supply chain visibility, cognitive rules-based ontology, Noodle AI, and Symphony has been doing some interesting work that's really deep in retail around price and price optimization. Met with several of their clients the other day and a lot of good work there. Now we have some consultants that are building solutions. We have Blue Cruise that has launched the digital twin and lights out planning, Bristol Cone Labs, which is doing work on risk management, and then we have open source technologies like Data Robot on the Cloudera platform that give us some advancements in cognitive computing. So you might look at this and go, wow, that's really hard to work through. Exactly. What we've got to do is we've got to test and learn, and we've got to take small pilots that allow us to start to learn how do we use these technologies. And I'm going to give you some use cases. So this is an Intera solution slide on cognitive computing, which represents a rules-based ontology. The concept is that you could have many ifs to many thens in a learning system in the supply chain where each of these nodes is a different form of analytics starting from the customer back. And this would allow you to combine engines that are cognitive with rules like ATP and allocation, which would allow a semantic reasoning layer that could allow you to sense, learn, and act based upon market conditions. So whether it's a market indicator, Internet of Things, a market driver, and I've put at the bottom the definition that's different on machine learning versus semantic modeling layer. A lot of technologists will say they've got AI, and the first thing I ask is, what is the technique that you use? Is it pattern recognition? Is it machine learning, which is really just giving you the representation? It is not giving you the semantic reasoning. Or do you have a semantic reasoning layer, and what does that look like? And if so, how do you build the ontology? So the ontology is a representation of truths in the supply chain. It's the first state for a learning engine. So for example, if this happens in the market, then this will probably happen. So, I had a company that was very tied to building starts. I, used to make ice cream, and we sold more ice cream in the temperature of 88 to 92 than any other weather condition. So an ontology is a state of what we believe will happen. Now, I'm going to give you some use cases of what I expect to happen with the cognitive computing technologies over the next year and a half, and so you can track it. One is the evolution of a cognitive digital twin. We already see Blue Cruise doing some work here. Kinaxis is working on pattern recognition and doing some work in this area. I think that we'll see far more advancement in the concept of a cognitive digital twin. So the concept is that a company has a lot of stuff. They have 7 advanced planning systems. Most people are not happy with their advanced planning systems. They don't work very well. And they have 10 to 12 enterprise resource planning systems. So the days of believing that we were going to have one ERP system, that's just fantasy. It's not going to happen. So the concept is that a digital twin would allow you to have a learning system on top of these technologies to sense, learn, and act, and to synchronize value chains. So you might say, well, why do I need that? Well, it's a simulation tool that goes beyond network design optimization. So it allows simulation. So you can ask a question if, tax and tariff gets to be X, what does that do to price? Or what should I do for modeling? Or if I introduce product Y, what's the impact? Or if I have, perhaps a strike at a supplier, what will happen? The digital twin allows the modeling and visualization of the supply chain. So people have a semantic reasoning layer in cognitive computing to make decisions. I expect that over the next 5 years, we're going to start to see a digital twin layered on top of all of the major companies greater than 1 billion in S&OP. And the reason is that satisfaction with S&OP is declining. If you look at the current state of S&OP effectiveness, where only 35% rate their primary S&OP process as effective versus the prior surveys that I did, where 65% rate their current process as effective, we've got 3 issues, and those 3 issues tie back to the lack of understanding of the executive team to understand the supply chain as a complex nonlinear system. One is there has been the push of a connected enterprise where we connect sales and finance data directly, which has actually degraded the forecast, because the only thing in common between a sales, financial, and a supply chain forecast is the word forecast. The supply chain is a mixed level forecast. The financial forecast is a different level of granularity and as a dollar forecast. And the sales forecast is one of the highest bias and error. So one of the things that's happening is we are degrading the forecast into the S&OP process, and we are not able to show the what if capabilities. And many companies don't understand the power of forecast value add as a modeling tool. Second thing that's happening is the supply chain is becoming far more complex. As we introduce the long tail and we have more nonlinearity, many of the technologies that we have are not able to do the modeling, and it adds complexity that's not well understood by the executive team. And so therefore, the modeling in the digital twin would allow people to see a feasible plan and to see the impact of the complexity. And the third thing is that we have a lot of change in the organization, whether it's mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs, new product launch. It would allow us to very effectively start to see some of the impact of that. So cool technology, digital twin. Evolution of cognitive computing. 5 years ago, 7% of companies greater than 5 billion were starting to trial cognitive computing. Right now it's 15%. One of the #1 use cases is the digital twin. Second use case is the customer-centric supply chain, and the concept here is to be able to connect rules, so ATP, allocation, order inventory rules today operate in isolation. But if we could have a rules-based ontology and a semantic reasoning layer, could we be able to rationalize orders and customers to be more customer-centric and to be able to maximize revenue and to test and learn across channels? One of the issues that we have today is we're not really good at sensing that a product is not going to make it in the market. Good news travels fast, bad news travels slowly. So if you introduce a dud product, people are in denial. They want to do X, perhaps a promotion or change a retail account. But in the customer-centric supply chain here, where you're decreasing the latency of seeing what's happening in the market, and you're looking at the combination of allocation and ATP rules and inventory matching, you have a much higher level of understanding what's in the channel, and you can test and learn, and you can evolve with greater demand insights. You can use the data outside in, whether it's the text mining data of sentiment analysis, or whether it's weather data, or rating and review data, or warranty data, or call center data, or you can use the demand insights and you can drive that into much better translation of demand. The fourth use case is extended supply chain visibility. So the concept here is that, the supply chain is global in many cases, and people are struggling with all of the changes. So shifts in tax and tariffs, slow steaming, alternative supply, sustainability, cognitive computing, and the digital twin allows us to look at the impact. I expect LlamaSoft with the OpEx analytics to introduce a strong digital twin by the end of the year. I expect that Kinaxis will continue their work. Blue Cruise will do their launch and continued launch in North America. They were previously in Europe on the digital twin, and that we'll start to see a lot of advancement of the digital twin against these use cases in the next year to be able to drive value. So I started talking about the research that I had done on what was going to happen in analytics. We talked about descriptive analytics, we talked about Thoughtspot, I talked about sentiment mining with SaaS, I talked about cognitive computing and what's happening in the cognitive computing market, and now I want to talk about the evolution of value networks. One of the opportunities for us is to be outside in, to be able to look at how do we manage value networks. So I had a client who called me and said, I've got a Reba and I've got GT Nexus and I've got a Limica, and there's no way to connect these together. And I thought, well, surely there must be an easy way. So I connected people and found out there isn't. Each of the individual supply chain operating networks have their own canonicals. They're not interoperable. So we build a vision of, could we connect trading partners through canonicals with interoperability and use blockchain and, drive higher advancements of visualization. And networks come in all different flavors. One is one-to-one, and that's what most people are doing with EDI connections. EDI is like old-fashioned mail. I open the letter, it's not bidirectional, it's usually out of date when I get it. The one-to-many work that's happening in supply chain operating networks with tools like Nulogy and Alemica and E2Open allows us to push data in a more seamless way so that we decrease the latency. We can get data pushed almost real time through the supply chain operating networks, whereas EDI tends to be more batch based. We still are a long ways off from many-to-many networks, and our supply chain operating networks only allow us to connect through transportation or manufacturing or sourcing. We do not have networks today that go across source, make, and deliver. We have technologies that are advancing in the area of transportation, We have technologies that are advancing the area of sourcing. We have areas of advancement in contract manufacturing, but we do not have the evolution of source, make, and deliver across all of the value chain, source, make, and deliver, and today it's one-to-many. So I have a group called the Network of Networks, and I wanted to challenge the paradigm. And I've not made a lot of progress. It's been very frustrating. The current business models of the supply chain operating networks do not drive interoperability. You know, Ariba wants everyone to use Ariba. GT Nexus and Alemica have been the most open to driving interoperability. But there is no easy way to drive interoperability today across make, source, and deliver. And while I thought blockchain was going to be an easy answer, it is not. It's not really an answer today because the foundation of blockchain assumes that companies are going to share data, they've got collaborative relationships, and they're clear data standards. Those three conditions do not exist for most companies. So as a result, blockchain is really only relevant for a company like Starbucks, where they've got a trading partner network and they've got clear standards. It is not really applicable at this point in time for open networks. And so there's some scalability issues. And so what we're doing in the Network of Networks work is we're saying, what can we learn about supply chain operating networks, which have the onboarding, the mapping, the process canonicals, and the outboarding to be able to drive better value networks. And there's lots of companies that are running around, you know, touting their horn that they're great supply chain operating networks. And I would just say beware, because most of the companies are only putting a visibility layer across simple solutions versus more complex. Now, I talked about blockchain, and blockchain comes in many different forms. It's centralized, pushed out from the company. You've got the enterprise blockchain, where you're actually working inside the company. The low level of transparency, where you're not collaborating with a lot of data, are viable blockchain deployments. And I would recommend that you consider Boardwalk Tech. Boardwalk Tech is a technology that's been around for a while, which allowed distributed spreadsheets, and they have been doing some work on blockchain, fairly low cost, and where you do not need a lot of transparency in the network for either inside working across legacy systems or enterprise blockchain, we're having good luck. Now, the decentralized blockchain and the distributed blockchain, we're just not ready for in supply chain because we don't have collaborative relationships, we lack standards, and we lack multi-tier process evolution. So I encourage people to invest in the supply chain operating network technologies that are working on the adoption of the ISO 8000 standards, working on interoperability. I can continue to be disappointed in Ariba's lack of working on interoperability, but see real progress with Alemica, Infor, GT Nexus, and Nulogy. I'm worried about E2Open with, you know, building all of these systems on top of E2Open without the platform really being ready. But I'm seeing real progress with Alemica, Infor, GT Nexus, and Nulogy. And consider Boardwalk Tech for blockchain deployments. The last concept I want to talk about on cool technologies is the advancement of ISO 8000 standards for master data management. You know, one of the issues that we've had is that our standards have not really been able to adopt the pace of change that we're trying to work with. So we're working on ISO 8000 standards, and ALEI is the authoritative legal identity for a company. And one of my big ahas is, you know, the mapping of authoritative legal identities is far more complex than I ever thought. So we mapped Procter & Gamble over 200 legal entities, and many companies have even more than that. So We have a very naive concept of master data management in most companies where they're just trying to get the company name right. Is it Procter & Gamble with an E or an O, or a P&G with an ampersand? We're having those level discussions versus looking at tax identification and legal identities as its authoritative legal identities. And we've done a lot of work on what is the difference between the ALEI, the ISO 8000 standards, and the GS1 standards, and other standards, and those are available for everyone if you want to get into it. But just to give you an example, this is a Corning case study, and we did a webinar with Corning where they had 24,245 suppliers in 81 countries. They were able to verify 111 suppliers in 33 countries. 7,000 were asked to give more information to verify legal status, and they found that they had many duplicate records. So of the companies that could not verify their legal status, they found that many of these companies were not real companies. And, often as we have global operations, particularly as we move into Asia, we can have issues with perhaps we don't have a real supplier, or, gray good issues, and all companies have duplicate record issues. So as we move into the network of networks and we move into building value networks, one of the technologies that I think is pretty cool is the use of ISO 8000 standards with supply chain operating networks. We're not ready for blockchain, but we are making some progress in having some interoperability between existing supply chain operating networks and the use of ISO 8000 standards. So let me just wrap up. We're at a tipping point. Traditional optimization, linear optimization on top of ERP just doesn't get it. Descriptive analytics is being widely used and is driving value. Search engine optimization through tools like Thoughtspot is new and compelling and builds an extra layer on the descriptive analytics. Cognitive computing is evolving, albeit slowly. The adoption in next year will accelerate. And I gave you 4 use cases: the digital twin, demand insights, rules and engines together, and supply chain visibility are 4 use cases that I think will take steam for cognitive computing. When we talk about value networks, a lot slower. Be very, very careful on any of the deployments for blockchain. We're just really not ready yet based upon where we are in testing. Adopt the ISO 8000 standards and work with your supply chain operating network companies to drive interoperability. If there are any questions, I would love to answer them. I think that what we've got is a real tipping point in the industry, and I look forward to seeing greater adoption of analytics and insights. So as we get some questions, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. We do have a Networks of Networks event that will be in Antwerp, November 26th through 28th, where we'll be doing the sharing of the blockchain case studies and pilots that we've been working on in the European community. We will have some discussions around blockchain for cleaning of tanks and blockchain for supply chain finance. My original hope was that we could use the contracts within blockchain to be able to automate supply chain finance. We've run into a lot of problems there, but we're going to talk about what we learned. And then next year's event, every year I do an Imagine event where we really focus on the future of supply chain. That event next year is going to be in Franklin, Tennessee, to allow us to do some great visits to some companies in this area, and it's right south of Nashville, Tennessee. And at this conference, I handpick presentations of really next generation supply chain processes It's not a conference where people have paid speakers or sponsorships, but it's a conference where we focus on the future supply chain, and I will start to be putting that agenda out in the next week. So any questions, please put them in the chat box. I have one question about where to get more information on the Network of Networks work and the LEI work. And if you send me an email at laura.ceciri@supplychaininsights.com or on LinkedIn, I'll add you to that LinkedIn group so that you can see that work. I also have a question about transportation management, and I deliberately did not include transportation management in this deck, but we're having a redefinition of transportation management from the outside in, looking at Internet of Things and GPS data. The difficulty is that we've got lots of technologies around the use of the data, but the ability for enterprise apps to use that data is really not at a tipping point yet. So what we're going to see in the next 2 years is the redefinition of transportation to be far more outside in. Okay, I think those are my questions. Okay, I have a question. Okay. So am I aware of SAP developing digital twin technology similar to Blue Cruise on top of SAP IBP? Yes, there's a lot of discussion on that. However, I don't think that's going to be very successful because I find that people are not very satisfied with IBP. And so I think that is going to take a lot longer. Okay, let me look at some of the other questions that I've got here. Usually small to medium-sized companies are slow adopting to new technologies. I don't find that to be the case. I find that small companies can often adopt new technologies faster. I find that large companies are typically the laggards in this group. So I find it's really based upon what's happening in that company and the business considerations. Where should companies start on the movement on Excel spreadsheets and moving outward from Excel spreadsheets to even advanced planning? I think you've got to start by evaluating your current systems of how well you're doing on forecast value add and schedule adherence, and then start to test and learn with cloud-based technologies in the advanced planning area. Look at some of the newer cloud-based solutions that are easier to use and better to be deployed. Mark says, you can't have an effective S&OP process with just a digital twin. No, that's right. The digital twin would work in parallel with what's happening on the S&OP and would only allow the simulation. You would still need the technologies to be able to do the modeling and write to the system of record. Would I give some feedback about 09 and the evolution of cognitive computing? I think 09 has an interesting technology with the graph database. I find that many of the clients for 09 are feeling like they're in a bit of a science project, that it's still developing, and I would not classify them as a cognitive computing tool at this point in time. Question is, E2Open a supply chain operating network? Yes, E2Open is a supply chain operating network. However, I'm worried about E2Open based upon the current acquisitions and the fact that I just think they've lost their way. They've basically acquired a number of enterprise technologies that's sort of a hodgepodge versus really putting together systems for a network of network. And so I'm worried about E2Open and what's going to happen in the future there. Mark wants to know if I could give a little bit more information about a digital twin. So a digital twin is a rules-based ontology that will allow the simulation of what ifs on top of a complex enterprise architecture. So it allows the visualization and what if analysis to be able to simulate. It takes our traditional what if simulation to a higher level with better visualization and a semantic reasoning layer underneath it to be able to make it more useful. How long do I think it'll take to drive cognitive computing? I think that we're at a tipping point where we're going to start to see a lot more of it happening in the next year. All right, I will take all of the questions and put them in my blog post this week and give you some answers. Thanks for joining us today. Our next webinar will be on the evolution of organizations and the current state of supply chain talent. We hope to see you in November. Thank you very much.